a problem is not only a problem for American and global Jewry, it represents a threat to democracy. Those three themes were very clearly defined and promoted on Tuesday. Our task this evening will be to delve more deeply into the elements that created this moment, and also look at steps that are likely to require of us and others for moving forward. So, Rabbi, why don't we move to the next slide? In so many different ways, our relationship with the State of Israel has evolved and emerged over time. And any one of these moments was particularly significant to a generation of Jews. And all of them together represent the collective story of really the diaspora-Israel connection. There were times in which we were deeply engaged and connected to every moment and every aspect of Israel's evolution and development. There were times when we even questioned and critiqued Israel. And there were periods where some of us may have disengaged and even questioned the character and democracy and quality of the state as it evolved. But now in October and December of 2023, we have certainly come together in reaffirming this very interesting notion of Jewish peoplehood, the concept of diaspora-Israel connection. Let's move to the next slide. In so many different ways, we connect to Israel. Some of us recall great historic moments of its founding, of its defense in 1967, of its borders, and growing its presence. Symbolic relationships in the context of understanding the very special place that aspects of Israel, its universities, its technology, its agriculture, its biblical and Jewish history lines, all of which are powerful moments. And still for others of us, culture has a particular and powerful bent in how we understand Israel and connect with it. And finally, for many of us, crisis moments are constantly reminding us of the binding that we have, of the connections we hold with the Jewish state. Let's move to the next slide. I think we need to understand that what we are living with and experiencing at this moment is far more than simply a border conflict with Hamas. It is, in fact, a regional conflict, which also has global implications. We need to understand that the sponsor of Hamas is Iran. It is a funder, along with Qatar, and Qatar and Iran are those only two powers that have the capacity to, in a sense, control or regulate the outcomes of any one of these situations. We are looking at a series of 7 conflict potentials for the State of Israel. Certainly the Gaza represents what we are witnessing now. But to Israel's north in Hezbollah, we have another terrorist operation, significantly stronger and more developed than what we even have seen in Gaza. And what we see in Iraq, with various forms of revolutionary and Islamic jihad groups, represents a third front. A fourth front is involved with Yemen and the sponsorship of Iran in terms of Yemeni political and military behavior. The fifth site is Syria, as Syria has become a kind of expansion point for Iran, which uses Syria for shipping arms, personnel, and resources from Syria to Gaza and on to Lebanon. We also point to the fact that Iran itself, with its capacity to raise both militarily, financially, its power in the Middle East, becomes a major threat to the Israel story. And certainly the West Bank itself becomes another piece to the complexity of Israel's ability to defend and protect its core members and families at this moment. All of this evolved precisely because the State of Israel was engaged with the United States and the Saudi Arabians in beginning to shape a very interesting prospect of Saudi Arabia recognizing the Jewish state and of the United States involving the Saudis in a kind of military pact. This had interests and advantages to both Washington and certainly to Jerusalem. And the Saudis were prepared to move in this direction with a variety of requirements and requests on their part, along with demands that Israel itself was placing in this construct. All of that would become undone on the 7th of October. And we need to understand that Iran's goal here was in part to disrupt that moment, that possibility of a new peace accord between the most powerful, wealthiest, and influential nation in the Middle East, the Saudi Arabian kingdom. And that was its objective. We need to also understand that the United States is not singularly the only player in the region. Russia has been part of this region for a long history, for at least 200 years, and certainly during Soviet times, it was an extensive player in various parts of the Middle East. In the current Putin regime, Russia has particular interests in certainly isolating the United States from being seen as the major peacemaker and player. And its objectives include, of course, its ability now to have some control over Syria and to exercise growing influence in various other parts of the region. China's interests are economic, principally, but with some long-term political goals. Its political goals began to be achieved earlier this year when it was a country that was able to create a kind of peace accord, or at least diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, something that had not taken place in more than 20 years. So we need to observe Russia and China as factors in the region. China has a huge trade arrangement with a variety of Arab countries, has significant oil interests with Iran, and has continued a series of important relationships with Israel as well. But China has, in this moment, assumed the mantle of support for the Arab case, in this case, the case for Hamas. So what you are seeing in the United Nations, both by Russia and China, is certainly an alliance with the hardline countries in the Middle East, who certainly wish to, in a sense, isolate further Israel's ability to create both diplomatic, economic, and political gains inside the Arab world. Let's move to the next slide. Gaza itself is a fascinating piece of history. As many of you know, it is about the size of the city of Philadelphia. It has 2 million plus individuals living in it. It is a region that is 25 miles long by 7 miles wide. It is a historic area of the Middle East that the Romans and the Greeks were players in earlier times, and the Philistines in biblical times were the power center in the Gaza area. But in more modern times, we need to understand that the Gaza Strip was an unwelcomed piece of territory. Neither the Ottoman Empire, the British, the Egyptians, or the Israelis wished to actually occupy Gaza. So it becomes a kind of no man's land in the sense of having any kind of outside authority in control of its destiny. As a result, in the vacuum of having a power that would control, develop, and nurture the Gaza Strip, what we have seen is the evolution of groups such as Hamas, which have arisen and taken power in 2007. Hamas's governing principles, and if you have not studied those principles, it is an essential requirement if you wish to understand the behavior of Hamas at this moment. There are more than 13 references in the Hamas charter dealing with Jews and Israel, and all of them particularly point to efforts to liquidate, annihilate, and remove the Jewish presence from the Middle East. So we need to come to an understanding that Hamas is a terrorist group with a formal and serious commitment to the annihilation of the Jewish state. The second principle here with Hamas, it is an extremely well-organized infrastructure. It has two core elements. It has a kind of domestic affairs agenda, and it has a military apparatus. And these are very well managed, and they are highly centralized, but much of the decision-making around Hamas's operations do not take place in Gaza at all, but take place in Qatar and elsewhere in the Middle East. So what we are seeing on the ground is often dictated from literally thousands of miles away by the powers associated with the governing infrastructure of Hamas. Hamas has institutional structures across the world in various places, using various pseudonyms and covers for purposes of financial fundraising and for initiatives associated with securing arms. So I would point to the importance of understanding one's enemy and understanding its goals and its principles of operation. The next slide, please. In the context of what has happened over these past 6 weeks, we need to understand that the American Jewish and global Jewish response of October 7th and forward has been really quite extraordinary. If we remind ourselves, stepping back from the 7th of October and rethinking where and what was happening prior to that date, we would find the global Jewish world in great division, divided over the state of Israel and its current government, the 37th government of the state, and its policies or projected policies regarding the judiciary, regarding security matters, regarding the West Bank, and regarding religious rights and church-state relationships. All of that collapses, in a sense, on the 7th, where upon that moment, a global Jewry has raised more money to support the Israel enterprise at this time than at any point in the history of the Jewish people. We have surpassed the Six-Day War. We've surpassed the Yom Kippur War. We have collectively raised more money than we have raised over the course of the past 10 years for Jewish financial support for Israel. The fundraising is quite interesting. If in the past those monies were all generated to and through federations, here in 2023, we see an extraordinary expansion of choice where donors are giving to Israel Trauma Center, to hospitals, to the American Friends of the IDF, to the Israel Red Cross, and to an associated group of other institutions, creating this web of giving that is both very localized and also very much centralized. But what we are also experiencing, just as we have achieved this great ability to create the resources on the ground that will be essential for Israel, we are seeing a huge public opinion war, a war that we, in all candor, are losing. And we know that in the context of what we are seeing happening on university campuses, and certainly in what we are seeing in terms of some of the editorials and commentaries from various sources across the globe. This will be an ongoing challenge for the organized Jewish communities here in the West, but it will be an incredibly important one as we understand the conflict has huge implications for public opinion. American public opinion on Israel remains still positive. And I will point to you that we have 2 studies in the last 6 weeks that tell us that Americans still support Israel over its opponent, Hamas, in this contest. And certainly American Jews, by overwhelming numbers, are endorsing and supporting the case for Israel. What we have identified, however, is that this is an interesting shift in behaviors, and we'll talk about what those shifts are in a few moments. What we are also seeing is American Jews reporting through various studies, including the Jewish Federation's of North America November report, where 72% of American Jews said that they feel less safe today due to the rise of anti-Semitism. So with that in mind, let us go more deeply into the post events of October 7th. Next slide, please. In so many different ways, we are seeing how this sort of battle has come to the United States and not simply on the battlefields of the Gaza Strip. The Washington demonstration, as we pointed out, is one such expression. Certainly, the battles we are seeing at major American universities is particularly significant, mostly very challenging to our Hillels, our Jewish college students, and to Jewish faculty in a kind of war of words and ideas taking place on campuses. The battle in Congress is less over whether Israel is to be supported or not, as there are only 10 members of the House who at this point would vote against additional aid to Israel. So the battleground here is between Republicans and Democrats as to whether to combine, as you know, legislation to support the Ukraine and Israel, or to separate out these agendas and to raise financial legislation specifically for the Israel war. I think that we are increasingly concerned about security of our institutions. And even as late as this afternoon, we were made aware of incidents of synagogues being swastikaed, and in the case of a synagogue in Armenia having been burned. We are aware of indeed numerous examples and incidents of attacks on Jews. And as you may know, the ADL is reporting a nearly 400% increase over the last number of weeks of attacks, harassment, and vandalism committed against Jews, Jewish property, and the Jewish community. There are groups in the Jewish community who do not stand with the majority of American Jews at this time. The Jewish Voice for Palestine, JVP, and If Not Now, When, are both organizations that clearly have felt that Israel's policies towards the Palestinians generated this, and they therefore are unprepared and unwilling to embrace Israel at this moment, critical of its policies and practices as a result. Let's move to the next slide. What we are seeing in this country and more directly on college campuses is really a battle over ideas. And intersectionality is the core issue here for many folks who are critical of Israel and have joined groups to oppose Israel's actions and discount the attacks on Jews in Israel and the 240 hostages, the 1,200 lost lives, as being the fault of Israeli policy, and therefore placing Israel as a kind of colonialist state where Jews are controlling and dominating over other peoples. So the argument of intersectionality is that all people of color and minorities come together around a shared agenda of facing oppression and responding to oppression. It is also the notion, the perception, not true, but the perception that Jews are white, and therefore a white power dominating people of color in the Middle East creates yet a second arena of contention and anger. And the third perspective here is that Jews are not part of the intersectionality community, meaning they are not part of an oppressed minority because they have become, in quotes, white. And their whiteness is that they have taken on the attributes of the government and of the white establishment. They are seen as powerful and therefore disqualified as being part of any minority community of oppression. The next slide, please. We have a good deal of data about American Jews, both from this moment, but also from the Pew studies going back to 2021. And here we have data to point to the degree of Jewish engagement. And rather than walk you through each of these statistics, I simply want to point out to you that, as we will see in other data that we'll look at in a few moments, the degree of engagement by Jews is in part tied to their religiosity, whether they are Orthodox, conservative, Reform, or non-affiliated. And part of it is tied, of course, to the number of experiences Jews have had with Israel in terms of their numbers of visits, their engagement with having families in Israel, or having other ties to institutions of Israel. The next slide, please. We also have a political divide. We have a significant percentage of American Jewish voters who we would call identity politics voters. They tend to be single issue voters, where Israel, for example, is perceived as a highly important centralized perspective as their voting modality, their voting model. They tend to more frequently vote Republican, and they tend to look for security and for foreign aid and for strong national defense as the basis of their votes in defense of Israel and defense of American interests, both in Israel and elsewhere. We have a group of American voters, which we call progressives. They are part of the left wing of the Democratic Party, and we believe that about 8% of American Jews fit into a category of being progressive Democrats. And this is based on a study we've done on Jewish voting patterns, where there are elements of Jews who do not fit the normal sort of liberal to conservative perspectives, but lie to a point further to the left of mainstream American Jewish liberalism. The bulk of American Jews, based on the studies we have, would describe themselves or define themselves as either moderates or liberal Democrats, and they are generally comprised of Reform, conservative, and independent voters, Jewish voters, and this has been a pattern we have seen for much of the past 40 years. What we are seeing in terms of the politics of the Middle East is that as issues become more Americanized, meaning where all of the issues of Israel as a democracy, as a Jewish state, get debated and discussed inside the United States, we see deep organizational divides. We have seen friendships uprooted. We've seen synagogues paralyzed in terms of some of the conversations that can and cannot happen because of the debates about the kind of Jewish state that people identify with. So Israel has become highly politicized in many ways. And at this moment, some of these traditional identities of voters may actually shift over the next 12 months. Let's move forward. We have from the 2020 Pew study some interesting data about how people identify with Israel. And I found this to be particularly significant, that 87% of Orthodox Jews hold to the ideological, theological belief that God gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. And that compares, as you see here, to 46% of conservative Jews and 25% of Reform Jews. We have another base of examining this, and that is that 7 out of 10 Jewish Republicans and independents say that they are very or somewhat attached to Israel, compared to 52% of Democratic Jews. So the intensity of connection increases the more likelihood of one being potentially a Republican or an independent, although this is certainly only a gauge by which we examine political behavior. Let's move to the next slide. I think we need to understand what our biggest challenge is. And this slide, while it speaks to American Jews, we would need to also address it from the larger American population context. We now believe that we have 2 American Jewish audiences with regard to Israel and 2 American audiences in connection with Israel. We know that older American Jews, and we see it here in this finding, 66%, of Jews 65 and over are either somewhat or very emotionally attached to Israel. And we can understand that in the context of the history of their lives and the interplay of Israel in their lives. But what we are also seeing is this huge disconnect for younger American Jews and younger Americans, where 18 to 29-year-olds have a far lower level of connection, identity, and support for the Jewish state. And that will become the great battle lines as we move forward in winning this future war. The next slide, please. We just remind ourselves where we were on the 6th of October and before. We were in this moment of dealing with the debate over the unreasonableness clause that was being proposed by the government of Israel at the time. And that crisis of the divide, which literally broke apart the country, the Israeli society, for the past year, would suddenly be shifted in one moment by the events that would occur on that Shabbat morning. Let's move to the next slide. I think some of us come to the Israel relationship with various images and understandings. Some of us have a fantasy land view of Israel, that it's sort of the biblical homeland. It is some mystical notion of its historic base in history. Others frame it as a modern, Western, technologically developed nation state. Others of us look at it in terms of its liberal democratic inclinations, even if it is not always voting and behaving as a liberal democracy. But nonetheless, it is that alignment that draws us to Israel as what we describe it as a democratic and Jewish state. And certainly many of us come with very particular images of Israel, whether it's a particular institution within Israel or cultural experience or personal and social engagement that we have with individuals or communities inside the state of Israel. The next slide, please. I think as we now step away from where we have been and what has happened, and we encounter what we saw happening just several days ago in Washington, it now requires of us to think about what lies ahead. Certainly an issue that lies before us will be the future of how Gaza will be governed. And that will be a question to be determined by policymakers in Jerusalem and Cairo and elsewhere in terms of what will be the outcomes here with the ending of the Hamas presence and power inside Gaza. The second element for us will be we have huge debates and dialogues, both internal to the Jewish community, but beyond the Jewish community, in explaining why the state of Israel has the right to defend itself, and how and what one does to recapture those who are taken hostage, and how one interprets international law and practice with regard to territorial possessions or occupations such as Gaza. And then we will be discussing for ourselves the kind of Jewish future we would like to see, both in terms of Israel's future, but also how we prepare kids and grandkids and others, both inside the Jewish community and beyond, in terms of Israel education and Zionist understandings. And who will be the new Jewish actors who will begin to take leadership? We saw some of them on Tuesday in Washington, but we are likely to see many more emerge as we grow out of this moment. And no doubt, in light of the tremendous pushback, silence, and rejection we experience with regard to many voices that historically were tied to the Jewish community, how do we rebuild many of these ethnic relationships? And can we rebuild them? And that will be a striking issue for the Jewish community in terms of finding alliances for relationships and coalitions that we can work with. And we will probably have to retell the Zionist story to Americans and to Jews alike, in terms of an understanding of how did the state come into being? What does it represent? And how does it serve as a model, not only to Jews, but to others in terms of its capacity to excel in so many different ways as a beacon to the world of international civilization. And finally, we need to really rethink the premise of how we as American Jews will be able in the future to manage these kinds of conflicts, because there will be other moments in time where Israel will be challenged, whether by Iran or by Hezbollah or a variety of other potential issues that will bring Israel into the news yet again. And this is a kind of wake-up moment for American and global Jewry, as if we now have to rethink the entire proposition of this historic and valued connection. Thank you for your patience. I look forward to your questions, and let us begin to have a dialogue. So I don't know how, Rabbi, you would like to proceed with the Q&A, but I'm open to whatever suggestions you have. Rabbi, you're muted.
It's an unusual state for me. There's a question from Dave Lepkin. Who fills the Hamas bubble? Is the question.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Who fills the Hamas bubble is on the
Yes.
chat. And
yes, that's the major question. We certainly are not yet certain how that will be filled. One thing we're particularly concerned about are other terrorist groups that could emerge in Gaza, and that there will obviously be cells of Hamas that will be retained in Gaza after this moment. So it will require a kind of strong policing, whether done by the Palestinian Authority, by an international UN initiative, or whether by a series of Arab states collectively planning to govern or manage the Gaza area. Egypt has the most important leverage on that, because it is the central player in terms of the Arab world's relationship to Gaza, and has a lot at stake in terms of its own security in this regard.
yes, so please feel free to type questions into the chat. I see Marla Schwartz has her hand up. And so Marla, if you can unmute yourself and ask the question, you're on.
Thank you so much. My great niece was one of the 4 sixth-grade girls in Manhattan Beach who were assaulted verbally for their Jewishness, with commentary about they should not be alive, they should die. Positive responses about Palestine, no reference to the evilness of Hamas. So my question is, and the school district's response was not satisfactory to me as a former educator and aunt to this little 11-year-old girl. What can we do? What can we expect as more and more hatred and anti-Semitism comes about in our country and in the form of particularly our children?
Sadly, I think your case example is but one of so many, and as you suggest, we may be in for somewhat more of this. I think the first thing we are instructing folks to do is certainly not to retaliate, meaning if they are either physically attacked or verbally abused, the feeling is that it is best to not engage. And the second element here is to report all such incidents to Jewish authorities, whether that's the ADL, the Jewish Federation, or any other agencies that the family or persons are connected with. And the follow-up is to expect accountability from the institutions that are, in a sense, managing the populations or peoples who are involved in these situations. And that is to hold them accountable for both security, but also for the appropriateness of response, meaning, so what are you doing to educate kids about diversity or about Jews or about the complexities of the Middle East? What are you doing, to inform parents that their children have either acted in inappropriate ways, and whether the school district itself seeks to provide punishment, or whether they leave it to the responsibility of parents to inform, educate, and account for their children. That will be another element for determination between the parents and the districts. But all of this is an expectation we have, because we have a contract with the institutions of American society, and that we abide by the law, and we may disagree with others on a whole array of issues, but how we conduct ourselves and the ways by which we articulate our disagreements requires a kind of responsibility that we would expect from the individuals and institutions that we support.
A question. I don't know how to do this. How do you?
Zarika, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. You can hear me? I guess you can. Thank you. You mentioned about pursuing Zionist and Israeli education. And I think a good place to start is with us, at least with me. I'm not clear about, could you talk a little bit about the West Bank prior to 67, Jordan, Syria, and Gaza, and how do those develop prior to 67, and how did that all happen? Because that is the problem. That's the cesspool. How did a cesspool occur?
Rabbi, you'll have to invite me back to do a history of the Middle East, and more directly of the evolution of the state of Israel. But to help you, Zarika, with a brief reading of this.
Excuse me for interrupting you, but I said prior to 67, I'm talking prior to 48.
Okay.
Don't mean 67, I mean 48, because that needs clarification.
Okay, so if we go to just the end of the First World War, we remind ourselves that the League of Nations awarded mandates to France, Britain, and others. And those mandates covered all or much of the Middle East. Outside of Egypt, much of the areas that we're talking about were held by the British and French. And arbitrarily, the British really redesigned the region and created artificial countries in some measure. So Jordan is really a invention, if you wish, of the British to provide for a particular family of the Hashemites. And likewise with
we call them the Arabs. Jordan for the Arabs.
Yes,
correct?
no. But what I'm pointing out is that you have a series of developments here. Saudi Arabia provides a kingdom for yet another royal family, Jordan for yet a second, and so forth. And the point being that the British were trying to create ways to both govern the region, but also retain some control and support from the Arab world, especially against the Nazis, is part of the efforts to create some kind of coherence to the area. In 1947, the British turned to the United Nations and leave it to the United Nations to create the future for what is called Palestine. And Palestine consisted of what was an Ottoman region of control by the empire for several hundred years. And it was formerly a Roman definition. Palestine is rooted in the Roman era. And its design was to partition literally a part of the territory to the Jews and part to the Arabs, to create an international city in Jerusalem, and to sort of solve the Arab-Israel question by using this sort of duality. The British, having, in a sense, failed to control or manage that situation, leaving it to the United Nations, and the United Nations voting to adopt that resolution without the support of the member states from the Arab League. And with that in hand, you create really the scenarios of what follows: a Jewish national state, but no Arab counterpart. And in its vacuum, Jordan takes control of the so-called West Bank. Egypt takes control or governs Gaza. Syria takes the Golan Heights. And so you have a series of sort of state controls for what was to have been part of a Jewish and Arab partition. So I think that gives us at least the framework for understanding that this has a deeply rooted history of where governments, in a sense, have just made arbitrary choices here, and the inability on the part of the Arab world to accept the state of Israel leaves that vacuum and continues to have left that vacuum as one of the unresolved issues of the region.
So can I just, a little follow-up, another question, small one. So the Palestinians who lived on the land, which is now Israel, including the West Bank, including Gaza, that land, those Palestinians, whether they were Jews or Arabs, because they were both Jews and Arabs who were Palestinians at the time, the Arabs were supposed to go to Jordan or Egypt, or stay in the land as citizens of Israel. They were to become citizens of either Jordan or Egypt, or they could have gone to Syria and Lebanon if they wanted to, or they could stay in Israel as citizens. The Arabs make a different choice and they go to war. Is that correct?
Yes, but none of the Palestinians were ever offered citizenship in any Arab country.
That's my point. You made my point. Thank you. So that argument that keeps popping up about the Jews being, I don't know, all the horrible names that are given to us and all the horrible names that are given to Israel, the most important that's always forgotten is that Jordan didn't give him that option, Egypt didn't give him the option, and none of the Arab countries gave him that option. So now we are the bad guys. We are the guys, although we are continuously trying to defend ourselves.
Thank you. Yes.
All right, I'm going to
Thank
move to Cantor Elon. You had your hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to share one other option after Marla's very, very sad sharing about her family. I am so troubled by the fact that once again your family has been touched by anti-Semitism, Marla. It's just awful. But I want everyone here to know that because we happen to be blessed to, most of us that are on here, to live here in the county of Los Angeles, that we have another option available to us whenever we experience any kind of hate speech or hate acts, whether or not they are crimes. And that is to dial 211 or go to laversushate.org or .com, I think it is, and to report those incidences. And at that point, then the county also takes a legal interest as well as an interest in our own mental well-being and stuff like that, and gets involved with trying to help us as well. So I just wanted to share that resource with everyone, because dialing 211 here in LA County is such an important resource that we need to know about right now when we are facing hate speech in so many places that we go. And it also helps our police forces and our sheriff's department to start to understand where there may be things brewing that they're unaware of. So I hope that helps you too, Marla, and that your family can take advantage of that.
There's a question in the chat. Our government supports a two-state solution, but the government of Israel does not. How do we convince the Israeli government to come around to a two-state solution? Better you than me.
It's a very difficult question. Let me just suggest the following, that the current government will most likely not remain in power after this conflict is brought to a close. And I say that based on the fact that Prime Minister Golda Meir, after 73, indicated her decision to step away. And whether or not the current prime minister agrees to step away or not, my sense is, looking at the Israeli polling data, he does not have the votes to be reinstated or to maintain the leadership that he now has. So that may open the conversation to this broader question, because the current government would not entertain a two-state solution. And increasingly over the last number of years, public opinion in Israel has moved, sadly, at least in my view, and we can disagree on this, away from opting for the two-state model. Part of that grows out of incidents of terrorism. Part of it is simply the intransigence we've seen in the Palestinian scene and in the Arab world. And part of it is because Israel perceives itself, at least some in the political establishment, as being able to expand the Jewish presence in parts of the West Bank and elsewhere, and not open, therefore, to a true two-state model for solution or solving this issue. There's no guarantee that even should an agreement be achieved, that it will be viable, simply because of the nature of groups such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad and others that operate in the region that are not committed to a peaceful outcome. So we need to understand that there are forces both on the Israeli side and in the Palestinian communities who do not hold a two-state solution as being viable and do not believe the other side ought to even exist. So we have to live with all of these realities when we move forward.
Dr. Windmueller, as we look at that two-state solution, I just want to jump in and ask the question. There's been at least twice where the Israeli government has presented the Palestinian Authority with peace plans, including a partition of Jerusalem into an eastern side that would be the capital of the Palestinian state, but that's been turned down in the past. Do you foresee that this might be a turning point where perhaps on the Palestinian side, that particular, let me call it intransigence, would be moderated?
I mean, I think, Rabbi, it's possible, but I'm not sure it's going to immediately follow the events of the last number of weeks. I think both sides are rather raw and not ready for serious and realistic negotiations. So we're going to see a period in which I think the United States will tread somewhat lightly in moving forward any new proposals for a two-state solution, but I think ultimately that will occur. And by the way, those individuals running for president of the United States in their fourth year, and this will be Joe Biden's fourth year, generally don't introduce new initiatives in the Middle East. Biden introduced one in his third year, which was the Saudi Arabian proposal. And of course, sadly, in my view at least, that has been set aside due to the events we're now living with. But likely in the next administration, whether it is of the current political leadership or some other leadership, we will again see efforts to create some kind of modeling of some ways to have two states in the region.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Jessica Feldman. You've had your hand up, Jessica.
Hello, let me take my hand down. Okay, thank you. Two things. I have a question and I have a resource. The resource is something I just put into the chat. Dave and I read a blogger, or I don't know if he's a journalist, but he just likes spending a lot of time doing very deep and out of the box and incredible lateral thinking on all sorts of world stuff. And he just started looking at the Gaza and Israel thing. I highly recommend you guys look around at some of his articles. This one in particular talks about the Gaza trap, looking at it globally, both the Israeli perspective and the Gazan perspective. And for example, he analyzes the differences between the 1988 and the 2017 Hamas charter. Point by point, he brings up some interesting things. So for everybody, this guy is called Thomas Pueo. I can't pronounce it. And he's really someone good to look at. And my question is, if you were a West Bank resident, non-Israeli, if you were an Arab, a Muslim, a Christian, would you now be saying, I hope the Israelis don't pull out of the West Bank. We don't want to happen to us what happened to Gaza?
It's an interesting scenario. In some measure, the West Bankers are already living with some of the same problems. They have a government that hasn't, in a sense, been accountable to them, has not held an election in some 13 years, I believe, and has not delivered on what it could conceivably still offer them, even as a non-state, as a non-formal government in the sense of sovereignty or autonomy. So if I were such a citizen, I would be actually bemoaning my current state as well as the one that obviously has befitted or been situated in Gaza. But thank you for your lead on Thomas Whale. That's most helpful.
So Dr. Windmueller, there are two questions I'm going to coalesce in the chat somewhat. The first one is, Israel will maintain presence in Gaza for the foreseeable future. What does that look like both for military and social services? And the other question was, Israel is surrounded by authoritarian Muslim states. How would it be possible to create governments in Gaza and in the West Bank that can coexist next to Israel? Those seem to me to be somewhat connected.
Well, I think the question itself is demonstrating the complexities of this situation. Whether Israel remains in the area to be a governance even for the short term, and what does that look like? Because there is likely to be, in the immediate period following the end of the formal conflict, all types of guerrilla warfare and all types of potential disobedience in reaction to the Israeli presence. The second element here is that the situation may require, as I suggested in the presentation, a third-party presence, because I'm not certain that any of the Arab states and governance structures in the region are prepared to really invest and take on this role. Financially, Egypt is in no condition to do so. Jordan is clearly not a power in the region and has minimal capacities even in self-governance. And the Jordanians have a huge Palestinian population, which they are living with as a kind of tinderbox arrangement. And if you've ever been to Jordan, you get the feel of what that intensity is like in that society. My reading here is that we are most likely going to see some kind of international peacekeeping operation rather than Israeli forces, and I think that would be beneficial to Israel as well.
There was a request to please spell Thomas Whale's name, the blogger. So, if,
Okay, I'll get that in there.
And next, Debbie Organ, you have your hand up.
You need to unmute.
Debbie, have you unmuted?
Thank you, Dr. Windmueller. I'm connected to Hadassah in the desert area, and we were blessed to have you as a speaker with us. I have two questions to ask you. One pertains to the religious aspect, and the other pertains to what's currently going on in the city of Teaneck, New Jersey. And I just want to give a shout out to Elon Davidson because he grew up with my son, Eric Organ. They grew up in Los Angeles in the modern Orthodox Jewish community. Teaneck is a model of unity because 40% of that community is Jewish, and a large group of it are modern Orthodox Jews coming out of Yeshiva University. They also have a high Muslim population, and they have been a community that they were like one of the first to have busing in integration of the school systems. Now, according to my son, and he's very much involved with the Teaneck Volunteer Ambulance Corps and stuff like that, the people are afraid to come out of the house. People are not going to the kosher restaurants. They're not going to the halal restaurants. There was a resolution when this took place at the city council to indicate that Israel has the right to defend itself. And you had where the pro-Palestinian people were very upset, but they should have also said, and those poor Gazans. One of the questions, as you indicated, with your statistics, that it is the religious who are majorly playing a role in the Zionistic and the right to survive and all of those things among Israel. A question was also asked about the West Bank, and I have family living in Efrat. And Efrat is one of those West Bank communities. It's Rabbi Stevie Riskin from Yeshiva University World, and they do have a symbiotic relationship with their Arab, neighbors. They support businesses together and things like that. Yes, a few months back, you had an attack on a murder, actually, of Efrat residents. The shooting in their car. They were, interestingly enough, from the UK. By nationality originally. They weren't Americans, and they weren't Sabra-born Israelis, although I believe the kid was. Where does all of this fit in terms of when we talk about Israel, it's always the state of Israel, the state of Israel. But what happened to Medinat Yisrael? What happened to Eretz Yisrael? What happened to Bnei Yisrael? Where did those concepts disappear to, and why?
Well, I mean, I think, Debbie, in some way, what seems to have happened is that we've become so state-focused on the basis of the politics that we've sort of all been living with, whether it was about, the Netanyahu government, or whether it had to do with the issues of the settlement of the West Bank, or whether it had to do with a whole host of the policies and issues, all shifted from the notion of the sort of the Zionist story and the story of the land and the story of its people to the story of the state. And I think that is why some of what you cite has been lost in this context of politicizing really all aspects of the Israel story, and thereby creating fewer sort of alternative ways of both describing and living in a context where it becomes more reflective of these diverse identities. And so our identities now are all shaped by our political allegiances and alliances, rather than by sort of the character of the Jewish people and its various cultural, religious, and social expressions.
How do you see it going back?
I mean, part of that grows out of the American experience, meaning what has happened in this country has also become, this watershed of the divides between and amongst us. And I think that has simply sort of been played out as well in Israel. so it's a phenomenon that I think is happening in Western civilization in more general terms, where we've seen the issues of authority and governance almost dominate over culture and community. And that's a loss that all of us, I think, are experiencing. I don't know the quick and easy answer. I think it begins bottom up. I don't think you're going to expect governing bodies to sort of recreate the cultural and the social and the ideological mixes. I think that it generates itself from community building and community models, and possibly some of those that you've cited, which serve as, maybe prototypes for what could happen or might happen in society. And that's the critical piece. I mean, I think we want to be able to pick up the phone and be able to call our Jewish counterparts, even if we don't religiously practice the same way, to our Muslim counterparts, even if we don't see eye to eye on all the politics of it. And all those doors seem much more closed today, much more narrow. And that gives us fewer of these sort of modalities of operating differently than where we find ourselves, which is far more constrained. And a lot is lost as a result. And our children, I think, are the losers as well, because they don't have the benefit of seeing the beauty of diversity actually playing out.
Thank you.
You mentioned the idea of an international governing force to be put together for Gaza. But on the Israeli side, I don't think there's a great deal of trust if that were to be under the United Nations in general. Do you have any comment about that?
No, you're absolutely correct. I mean, Israel has had its challenges on the Lebanon case with the United Nations emergency forces there. It had the disagreements with the UN over certainly what happened along the Sinai and Egyptian borders, already going back to the 1956 situation, and then again in 67. And so we have a history here of where the UN-Israel relationship is at best a very uneven and certainly mistrusting one. And the very fact that the current Secretary General of the UN was not particularly embracing, to say the least, about the language he used the first days of this war, and immediately sort of targeted Israel, it further created tensions between Jerusalem and the UN. And no doubt the recent actions in some of the operating bodies of the UN, where they've targeted Israel, as they have historically done, as the sort of, a primary enemy or the primary cause of conflict or tension, has therefore really created a problem for UN's ability to be a reasoned voice and a welcomed voice in the areas that Israel is responsible for. But I don't know that, the possibilities of creating something through the European Union, capacity to use various other formulas for building this international force without per se the UN logo, is always a possibility, and Jerusalem may actually wish for that type of operation to be formed.
Since I'm not seeing other questions, I want to ask you one more. You may want to pass on this one. But Israel has said, I believe, that if Hamas were to release the hostages, there would be a ceasefire. And I personally have some very strong feelings about ceasefires. On one hand, there's the humanitarian pause, as opposed to a ceasefire, which really means, if you will, an armistice and a stoppage. Would you like to take up either of those pieces?
I was just listening to an Israeli general who was talking about the IDF's code of conduct and integrating that into his and the government's understanding of both international law with regard to the conduct of war, and also the overlay of Jewish thought and practice having to do with rescuing of the hostages and of when and how one conducts moments of separation or ceasefires. And it's really quite a fascinating encounter, because the Israeli response here is that they, to the letter of the law, are holding the IDF personnel responsible for the conduct that they must provide in managing what happens with civilians and in managing what happens with those that are either captured or who are prisoners of war. And Israel is particularly acute to the fact that it's being criticized for things that it has done, whether rightly or wrongly, and therefore is taking into account these rules of conduct with great precision and care. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. The decision to have a ceasefire against a terrorist organization is highly challenging, to say the least. So there are many voices who would hold to the fact that if this were a standing army, you would expect that there might be a period of a ceasefire. But this is not a standing army. This is a terrorist operation who has taken 240 plus members of your community, 30 of whom are children, and whose behavior in its conduct so far simply demonstrates that it does not respect or live up to the codes of international warfare. So I side here, interestingly enough, with the Israelis on being somewhat less open to ceasefires, and until there's real demonstration that the other side has abided by or has delivered upon some of the things that are being called upon it by the international community and by Israel, that it must provide, which includes certainly the immediate release and return of these hostages.
Do you have the sense that Israel will fight this battle all the way through until there is either a complete elimination of Hamas, if that's possible, or perhaps fight it until they ask for peace rather than just a ceasefire? So if there's some resolution of all of this, with all this loss of life, that it will stand for something.
I don't obviously know what is in the mindset of the IDF, but I do know what I saw happen this past week. The Secretary of State returned to the Middle East, and he did not return just to be showing a kind of American support at this moment for Israel. I think he came with a message, and the message probably was something on the order of threefold. Don't let this war be allowed to expand or bring other folks into the conflict. Try to be as humane as possible in the conduct of your warfare, and end this thing as soon as possible. And because Washington, in a sense, is holding back, I mean, the international community, which wants to censure and to condemn Israel for pursuing this. And I think there is a U.S. interest here to also be able to play in the Arab world, which it needs to, and therefore it needs at least some symbolic response from Jerusalem that Israel will bring this to a fairly rapid conclusion. My IDF sources indicate that they believe this will be over within the next several weeks.
Michelle Shahan, you have your hand up.
Put that hand down. Stephen, I hate to even ask this, but I'm going to. We haven't seen or heard of any proof of life, and we keep hearing of more loss of life with hostages. Do we even know if they're still alive? Do we believe they are? How do we know? We heard that there was a baby born in captivity. How do we know? How do we continue to hold on to that hope and that belief that they are alive and that they are being taken care of or safe or anything?
Yeah, I am certainly not the person who can give you any assurance on this. I'm sorry, Michelle. But
you always taught us to ask the hard questions, Stephen.
and I did, and you've done it. What I would point out is that Israel is talking with Qatar, and Qatar may have some of that information. I may have shared it with Israeli officials. The reality is that the Israeli officials will certainly not share with either the families or the international community any of this at this moment, for sure. One can only hope and certainly pray that the Hamas elements are abiding by international practice about how one manages and treats hostages and those being held during wartime. But we have no public information to give us any sense that we have reason to be optimistic or otherwise.
I see in the chat, Malin Dollinger has asked or said, have an idea for survey of Jews in the diaspora. Ask diaspora Jews if when they have visited Israel and why they went there or did not go there.
Thank you. Well, it comes from the family of Mark Dollinger. It has to be a thoughtful social science type of question, which I would not have expected from any other household in the South Bay. But it's a great question. I think actually we do have some studies. I am, in all candor, don't know the data about those studies, but about the nature of American Jews visiting Israel, the motivations, the rationale, that is the reasons for doing so and whatnot, and the reasons why others do not. And I think we have a good deal. Brandeis University's Cohen Center has really done a nice job of giving us a lot of good information about certainly birthright participants, and also has done some real interesting stuff in local Jewish communities. Their studies include 25 different Jewish communities where we have really solid data about those Jews in these particular communities and their travel experiences with Israel. But always a thoughtful question from the Dollinger household.
And another comment in the chat, I would assume that the moment the hostage issue concludes, Mossad agents will dispatch with Hamas leadership in Qatar and Iran. The dispatch meaning kill.
So, I mean, I think, as I said in the presentation, we believe many of the senior officials of Hamas are not in Gaza, and we know that to be the fact. In Qatar, there are significant numbers of them, and elsewhere in the Middle East, and certainly the Iranians have made sure that some of the key elements of the leadership are cared for under their governance.
I'm reminded of the last real war with Gaza, if I can call it that, where the leader of Hamas was in Damascus, I believe, and said that that they were willing to fight until every Palestinian in Gaza was dead. But that was rather disingenuous since he was not there.
Yes.
So,
Israel has what it had in Munich in 1972. It has a master list, and it is committed, the Israel military is committed to the removal, and whatever you want to define as removal, of Hamas leadership. So that may take the form that we've seen in other situations with Israel, of simply removing an enemy wherever he or she may be, and not simply in the context of the war, but by elimination practices that will occur over the next several years throughout the Middle East or wherever else Hamas folks may be residing.
And Dr. Jeff has asked, how has Qatar stayed under the radar until now? Iran has been well known, but not Qatar. And I would also ask the question about Qatar supplying aid to Hamas over the years, with perhaps the implicit agreement of the Israeli government.
Yes, I mean, we didn't go into this, and I'm not sure how much we want to spend on this, but the government in Jerusalem has had an arrangement to shuttle Qatar monies into Gaza for some years, and has provided certainly the tax dollars that are aligned and associated with Gaza back into Gaza. So the Israelis have, in a sense, looked the other way and allowed, the operation of Hamas to be the governing body, and it has been since we noted in 2007. So this was all very convenient as long as there was a kind of peaceful transition of these resources and there was no threat to security. All of that now gets exposed, and all of that now gets revisited. So it raises the question also about Qatar's relationship and how long and how deep it has been. And we remind ourselves that Qatar is the home of Al Jazeera television, and therefore it's an important base of influence and of messaging in the Arab and Middle Eastern worlds. Marvin, you're on silent mode again.
Sometimes pressing the space bar needs me, and sometimes it doesn't. Mara Lowenstein asked, how do you think Jewish college students will be affected moving forward in the next few years? My twins will be applying to colleges next year.
I almost don't want to go there because I'm so, just before coming on to our show, onto this conversation tonight, I was just reading the reports out of Northwestern. And I just am very depressed, frankly, because the college community, which ought to be the center of discourse and engagement, is also become right now the hotbed of really anti-Israel and anti-Jewish behaviors that are really outlandish. And Northwestern may have taken the lead tonight in what is happening there, and what we've seen at Harvard, at Cornell, at Penn, at George Washington, and you name the institutions. So I really worry for our students, and I know it will raise the question of where do we send our kids and how do we prepare them, and that's becoming much more the longer term issue of what the university has meant to the Jewish community and what it may mean moving forward. It's a very different construct, and it will require us to really rethink how do we really help our kids prepare their experience, especially if intersectionality the notions that are now being put forth by professors and student organizations and even administrators raises these problematic environments for Jewish students.
Thank you. And Debbie Organ, this may be the last question. Let's see.
I put a question in the chat and it hasn't been addressed.
I'm sorry, I didn't see it in the chat.
Maybe you can share it with us.
You were mentioning the British mandate, which was set by the League of Nations, not by the United Nations.
Yes.
And prior to the British mandate being established, following World War I, what we call Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
Now, one of the things that Israel has been consistently put down for is their policy regarding who owns what land in Israel. And the Arabs are maintaining that for many, many generations, hundreds and thousands of years, that they have farmed, had their orchards, and they lived there. Who actually owned the land when it was part of the Ottoman Empire? And how did title get established, or ever did it, following the British mandate?
That's a great question. I got asked that question on my final PhD exam, so I better have at least some knowledge about its outcomes here. First of all, the titles were all being held by the Ottoman Empire. They were not being held in the region of Syria or Palestine, or, that whatever the titles
Right.
to the area. So it was all controlled in Turkey at the time. The second is that beginning already in the 1900s, in the early 1900s, as you may recall, the Jewish National Fund and other groups began to purchase this.
Exactly.
So we have a long history of where titles were actually transferred to Jewish owners, and in this case, not really to individuals, but to the collective body of the Yeshuv, the formation of the early founding of the Jewish state. A lot of that, as you correctly point out, I think has to be revisited in terms of making clear what the historic trend or patterns were, that really none of these territories or lands were owned or held by those living on them. And therefore we need to remind folks about the complexity of landholding and how it was transferred legally and financially, involving the key players of the early 1900s.
Why has that not been addressed in the media?
Now, Rabbi, we're getting into what is, I guess we'd call the politics of how Israel is covered or managed.
Hasbara.
And I think what we're actually have to point out is that most of the folks covering the Middle East have no idea of the historical context of this story. In other words, they are told, you're going to Jerusalem and you're going to cover this war. And they may have the day before been doing a story on nutrition or childcare. And now suddenly they're asked to cover and put in context a war which is involving people who have a huge historic base or roots to this part of the world. And the complexities of government, the complexities of international law, the complexities of treaties, and you name the array of resources. So the reporters we have don't know enough to ask those questions and don't think about them in the context that they're doing a story today about a family in Gaza or about a family in Israel. and they're not putting any of this into the frame of how this all even happened. How did we even get to this moment in time? So thank you for reminding us of the frustrations of how and what we are seeing in the delivery of information.
It's
Okay.
very critical because one of the big factors that has caused people in the European Union and people in Britain to be angry with Israel is because they feel that land that belonged to the Arabs has been stolen from them and they've been evicted from land where in fact it might have been anybody's land. So we know it was Ottoman Empire, and we know that the Jewish National Fund that bought much of the land. Did these people ever buy the land? Did they ever own title to the land? No.
I've seen this kind of approach taken, by the way, as well at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland, where before every play there was a statement that was read about how much we owe to the Native Americans, and they have the name of that particular group, whose land we were sitting on at that moment watching the play. We can go, history depends on who's writing it and how far back you go to draw the line about this is where it started. It's very malleable, I think.
Well, 2000 20 or 25 is not going that far back. We're not going thousands of years or hundreds of years. This is fairly recent history.
Well, again, if you look at the recent history versus how far back do you want to go, there are those who would say that Hebron is an Arab city, but it had a continuous Jewish presence since biblical times until about 1929, when a massacre by the Arabs wiped out most of the Jews there and the
Right.
left. So where do you draw the line about what's the origin of that city? Is it after, is it in the 1930s, in the 1900s, in the 1800s? That's what I'm saying. Where do you draw the baseline? And to that general sort of question, Dr. Jeff has asked, has the area of Israel been a sovereign country at any time since the Romans trashed the temple?
Never.
I didn't hear the full question. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Has the area of Israel been a sovereign country at any time since the Romans trashed the temple?
No, I mean, I think that's always been an occupied area of any number of powers, and certainly the most recent of which certainly was the Ottomans.
Dennis Prager had put out a video that proclaimed that there had only been 3 sovereign nations in the history of that area, and all 3 of those sovereign nations were Jewish. Other than that, it had been a territory subsumed under somebody else.
Yes, that's right.
And then I think we will perhaps close with this one, which was, sorry. Yes, Mark Dollinger. We'll go 2 more questions. History versus historiography depends on when it is written, often different if written much later. Did you catch that one? Or does it sound okay?
I think I'll take a peek at his question.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very true. How history is written and how it's interpreted is really dependent upon the mindset and the willingness of the author to be open and reflective of what he is seeing or she is seeing and talking about. But often we find people who are polemics, and the focus of their idea is to tell their story through their lens rather than to capture what may be the complexities and realities of a particular place and time.
And then finally, is this issue bifurcated, or does polling indicate Jewish vote in the US is moving to the right, and might this sway the 2024 election?
Okay, now, Rabbi, for sure you have to bring me back, because my book, my 2021 book, The Impact of Donald Trump on American Jews in Israel, which was an essay, a series of essays looking at both people who supported President Trump and those who opposed him, and studied his impact on American Jews. And that book, published by Purdue University Press, which sells for only a few dollars, and I make nothing off of that book, by the way. It's the University of Southern California's property. Was simply its architect. So yes, I'm writing a lot about 2024, and I don't know that I can summarize in 2 minutes what's going to happen to the Jewish vote. First of all, we don't know what will happen. Secondly, what is happening right now will certainly have an impact on Jewish voting. The third factor here is that we believe the third parties in 2024 will be profoundly important to Jews, whether it's the No Labels Party, whether it's Robert Kennedy's run, whether it's the Greens or the Libertarians. We see them as potentially playing an important role as either spoiler or influence maker in the outcome of 2024. And we're looking at what most pollsters are looking at, which is that we see some bleeding, some loss of support for Joe Biden in some communities, in the African-American community, in the Latino community, in the women's community. And we have already a couple of studies on Jewish voting and Jewish ideas in terms of Joe Biden, but they are already pre-October 7th. And so we are not looking at those at the moment to give us some inclination if there's any change. Stay tuned, because that will be the interesting storyline as we get closer to the primaries and to the general election. And by the way, we can say 4 things about Jewish voting. Jews will vote. They will vote in extraordinary high numbers. Anywhere between 72 and 85% of American Jews vote. Secondly, we know that Jews are major donors to political campaigns. And watch, as I just wrote in an article that came out in Times of Israel yesterday, just watch where the dollars go. That will tell us an interesting clue about what the Jewish voting modalities might look like. 3, it's important to understand that Jews are going to be candidates, and they are going to be candidates for every different shape and form of American political life: governors, state houses, the Congress, and so forth. And we may very well actually have on the national ticket a Jewish vice president, should there be a non-labels party. There's some rumor that there'll be a Jewish candidate on that ticket. And fourth, we should understand that Jews account for less than 2% of the American population, but because of where we're situated in some key states, and not here in California, but certainly in states such as Georgia and Arizona, and states including Ohio and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, the Jewish vote becomes critically important.
Well, on that note of a chance for the Jews to be of critical importance, I think we will close off tonight. Thank you, Dr. Windmueller, very much for this informative, provocative, wonderful presentation. Thank you. And yes, we will have you back again.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night, and thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Stephen.